Morning, everyone, and Happy New Year. My name is Dr. Nicholas Hamisevicz, and I'm a program manager here at the East-West Center's Washington, D.C. office. I'm excited to welcome all of you and to host this great event on assessing religious freedom in Asia. Just yesterday, someone pushed back on my Happy New Year's greetings to them, saying it was already too late in January to be saying Happy New Year. But my argument was, and is, that if it's January and it's the first time seeing someone, you can wish them a Happy New Year. So this being my first event in January 2025, I wish all of you a Happy New Year. Another good thing about the month of January is that in addition to beginning a new year, there are other important dates throughout the month, especially kind of here in the US, that have significance and continue to focus ourselves on the important tasks and goals for the year ahead. Days like the Feast of the Epiphany, Korean American Day on January 13th, Martin Luther King Day, all help us to pause, reflect, and re-energize to accomplish those things we resolved to do starting on January 1. Today, January 16th, is another one of those days. Today is Religious Freedom Day here in the United States, a day where we focus on the essential right and liberty of religious freedom in our lives, countries, and in the vital region of the Indo-Pacific. With the elections that took place across Asia and with the many geopolitical maneuverings, religious freedom is interwoven throughout and will be an important part of events, advocacy, and interaction in the Indo-Pacific in 2025. We have a great lineup of speakers today in Knox Thames, Tehmina Arora, and Yaqiu Wang to help us understand the importance of religious freedom and how we should assess it in the Indo-Pacific, particularly in China, India, and Myanmar. Unfortunately, Lucky had family issues, so she's not able to join us today, but we have a great lineup for you, and we're excited about it. Let me give you the agenda, and we can get started. So I'm going to introduce Knox Thames, and he's going to give some opening remarks and set the stage for us, and then I'll come back and reintroduce our other panelists to have them talk for about 10 minutes each, and then we'll have Q&A with our speakers. So Knox Thames is an international human rights lawyer, advocate, and author who has dedicated his career to promoting human rights, defending religious minorities, and combating persecution. Over his 20 years of service in the U.S. government, Knox has held several key positions advocating for freedom of religion or belief, including at the State Department and 2 different U.S. government foreign policy commissions. He also has a new book out, Ending Persecution, Charting the Path to Global Religious Freedom, published last year. In April 2023, Knox joined Pepperdine University as a senior fellow, directing the new program on global faith and inclusive societies from the Washington, D.C. campus. In addition, since 2020, he has worked as a non-resident senior visiting expert at the United States Institute of Peace. Knox has written widely in many outlets. In addition to his recent book, Knox was the initiator and lead author for the book International Religious Freedom, Advocacy, a Guide to Organizations, Laws, and NGOs. So I'll turn over to Knox for his remarks. Knox, please. Thank you so much, and we look forward to your remarks.
Well, I want to start by just recalling an experience I had about a decade ago when I was part of a U.S. delegation visiting Myanmar. We had come to the country to understand conditions for religious freedom, religious minorities, and the situation in Rakhine State for the Rohingya. The government wouldn't let us go into Rakhine, but we had been able to go north of Mandalay to visit a Muslim community that had been the victim of a mob assault. And we went looking for this mosque that had been set alight. Couldn't find it. I had to actually get out of our car and through just hand signals and broken English on both sides, find the location. And it was sort of fitting that this mosque that had been attacked and torched was next to a cemetery because the mosque was dead now. People had died in it. And the larger community had sent really powerful message that the Muslims in this small village were not welcome. We walked inside the mosque and you could see how the fire had charred the walls and there was nothing there. And I kept a small fragment of that structure to remind me of the reality of persecution in Myanmar, but in so many places around the world. So I really appreciate the East-West Center hosting this discussion today on Religious Freedom Day here in the United States to think about ways we as a community of values, both in the United States and with partners in countries around the world and from different communities of all faiths and all backgrounds, can stand together against persecution. And that was why I wrote the book. As was mentioned, I'd been a civil servant working in different diplomatic roles for 20 years on behalf of the US government, working to promote religious freedom for everybody, everywhere, engaging governments, civil society actors, religious leaders on the importance of freedom of thought, conscience, religion, and belief. The book tries to do several things, and I spent a lot of time focusing on Asia because it's a area of great concentrated populations, but also a place of increasing repression on a number of fronts. So the book looks to sort of elevate the reality of what I talk about as a pandemic of persecution, a pandemic that's touching every faith community somewhere in the world. The Pew Research Center has done some fabulous statistical research every year looking at trend lines for restrictions on faith. And they find pretty consistently that roughly 2 out of 3 people on earth live in countries that restrict the free practice of faith. Now, that doesn't mean everyone's being actively persecuted, but it does mean they're susceptible to persecution. The reason that the statistics are so high is because China and India score incredibly low. So it's really good that if we're talking about religious freedom in Asia, we've got perspectives from both of those significant countries. But when in thinking about how to address this monumental challenge, this global challenge, I first wanted to be specific in terminology to define what is persecution. Here in the United States, and I think in the West, the term is thrown around pretty casually. And I think that's a mistake. So I take time to define persecution as involving violence or threat of violence. So arrests, tortures, beatings, murder, the destruction of homes and villages and places of worship. Violence or the threat of violence is a key component, as well as coupled with that, the lack of any accountability. So bad things happen here in the United States, but our justice system, while not perfect, generally brings about accountability. However, for communities that we'll be talking about today, that isn't possible, or that isn't available, it isn't provided, and sometimes it's removed from them. So we need to be very specific about our terminology. There are other things that are bad that we want to speak out against that violate international standards on religious freedom. They can be discriminatory, they can be harassing, they can be oppressive, but they don't quite meet this high threshold of persecution. So in the book, after defining this term and pointing to the need to be very specific about what it is and to use that terminology carefully, I then describe different typologies. Because again, this pandemic of persecution is overwhelming because so many people are impacted by it. But as someone who has been a policymaker in the past, understanding the specific challenges in specific countries is so important. Much like a doctor can't prescribe aspirin to cure cancer, we need to have specific tools to deal with specific mutations of persecution. So I define 4 typologies in the book. They are authoritarian, extremist, democratic, and terrorist. So in authoritarian, I focus on what's happening in China and in Myanmar. In an authoritarian situation of persecution, this is where the power of the state is brought to bear against a religious community or individuals belonging to a community that are either disfavored or unwanted, and they are crushed using the full power of the state and all the tools that are available there. And after defining this typology, I then have a chapter that focuses on China and Myanmar and what we tried to do, what I was involved in, what others were involved in doing from the US perspective to leverage our power and resource to try to push back against that authoritarian persecution. The next form is extremism that I talk about, and this is where you'll see religious leaders or community members acting outside of the mandate of the state whipping up mobs to assault homes, villages, places of worship with no accountability. There I talk about Pakistan quite a bit, a country I visited many times, but this also has implications for India because we see where mobs have been riled up to assault Muslim communities, Christian communities, especially around issues of eating beef, with really no accountability, no justice had for the perpetrators of the violence. And democracy is the third typology. And here I focus on India and Nepal. India, the world's largest democracy after independence, founded on this idea of a multicultural India, multi-faith India with a sort of secular underpinnings. But we've seen over the last 15 years or so, with the rise of the BJP and Narendra Modi, those foundations starting to crumble. And with persecution and democracy, this is where a religious majority uses the power of the ballot box to transform their beliefs into law and then can access state resources to enforce them. And we see this again with these dietary restrictions that only some Hindus believe in being forced on other communities, or the religious freedom laws that prohibit conversions out of Hinduism, or limit the ability of people to marry outside of the Hindu faith. And then the last form is terrorism. And there I spend more time looking at Iraq, which is outside the scope of our conversation today, but thinking about how can the United States and other countries help a community pick up the pieces after a genocide. And this can have implications for what's happening in China and Myanmar with the Uyghur and Rohingya communities. So with these typologies, as you can tell, I try to use real world examples from my experience, from what I've seen and observed. But I don't just admire the problem. I'm a practitioner of human rights. I also put forward some ideas for ways that the United States and other like-minded countries can leverage our resources, our influence to protect victimized groups who are experiencing persecution or at threat of persecution. And here I talk about 4 C's, and I'll start to wrap up here. The 4 C's that can guide an administration like the incoming Trump administration as they want to think about how to advance religious freedom and defeat persecution. The first is consistency, consistently raising concerns about religious freedom with friend and foe alike. Now, we've seen a consensus here in Washington develop about China's persecution of Uyghurs. I think that's very good. That's very positive, and it's needed. But we haven't had a consistent approach with India. And I think this has been a bipartisan blind spot, or perhaps even being willfully ignorant about the slide away from shared values between India's democracy and constitutional protections and what's happening now. And we've seen both Republican and Democratic administrations really bend over backwards to try to convince Mr. Modi for India to be a partner with us and a counterweight to China. But very few policymakers seem to be thinking about, well, what happens if the policies in Delhi start to look more like the policies in Beijing? That would be a tremendous setback for U.S. national security interests in the Indo-Pacific, but also our human rights policies in the region. I've written about, and I continue to encourage the United States to, as a friend of India, challenge the government to protect these foundational values that are shared between us. So that's consistency, coalitions, working with like-minded countries. The United States, of course, we have incredible influence and reach, but we shouldn't do it alone. Work with other like-minded governments, but also finding partnerships with religious communities and civil society organizations and advocates. And then call-outs, using the ability of the United States to make global news by talking publicly about situations of persecution. When I've worked earlier in my career at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, we would issue an 8-page report on China and an 8-page report on India, and both foreign ministries would kind of go off the handle with their denunciation of our little report. And I thought that was great, frankly. It was sort of free advertising for our report to 2 billion people, but it also demonstrated that it had been received and read, and they knew that the United States knew what was happening. And I think there's a need for the United States being a consistent voice, calling out abuses. And if governments like China and India don't like it, well, they can stop abusing their citizens. They have the power to ensure that we don't talk about bad things by not doing bad things. It's pretty simple. And then lastly, there need to be consequences. If the United States says human rights matter, then it really needs to matter in how we conduct our foreign policy. We need to make sure that human rights, religious freedom is intertwined into all aspects of our engagement with different countries, both economically, with energy policy, with military to military relations. Because we've seen with China, when we disconnect our values from our interests, China has actually reaped billions of dollars in US financial investment. And we just hoped that democracy would follow. But they were very savvy and they played a smarter game than we did. And now they've got resources to make them a near peer competitor throughout the Indo-Pacific region. And we don't have the leverage we once would have had to encourage them to go in a different direction because we separate our interests from our values. And I'm concerned that same approach is happening with India and with Myanmar, although a much smaller situation as far as their influence globally. So consistency, coalitions, call outs, and consequences. If we say it matters, we need to leverage all the resources we have to encourage countries to go in a different direction, not us imposing our values on them, but just saying this is how we approach these issues. And if you want to be a partner with the United States, then we will have a better relationship if you are respecting the rights of your citizens to pursue truth as their conscience leads without fear of discrimination or violence. And the choice is up to them whether to be a partner with us. But if we stand firm on this, I do think we can have a positive impact. And of course, we do this out of humility. The United States is not perfect. We've got our own challenges at home that we need to continue to work on. But if we wait to get everything sorted here domestically before we talk about these issues internationally, we'll never have that opportunity. And I've seen time and time again the positive outcomes that can follow U.S. engagement when we talk about these values in a way that is constructive, but also firm in enunciating why this matters to U.S. foreign policy. And I think China and India are the two, 1A and 1B for the new Trump administration as they think about human rights policy, security policy, energy policy, trade policy. And we need to be consistent in how we engage with both of them on these values issues like ending persecution. And with Myanmar, I think it often gets forgotten between these two behemoths, but there's also an opportunity that we can leverage our influence in a way to create accountability for the generals that are perpetrating this genocide, that are attacking the different hill tribe communities like the Chin, Kachin, Karen, that also have different ethnic and religious backgrounds, to make sure that they understand what's a priority for us and that if they're going to be part of the community of nations, they need to abide by these international standards. So I'll end here. I really appreciate, again, the East-West Center hosting this conversation, and I look forward to the two experts who have joined this call, and I'll be taking notes on what they say because I really respect and appreciate their work on these important issues. You're muted, Nicholas.
Sorry. Thank you, Knox. Really appreciate how you framed everything for us and pointed to the key areas where we need to focus on and work on. Please, if you have questions, those in the audience, please start putting those in the chat or in the question and answer forum, and so we can have those when we are ready. But let me now introduce the other two speakers. We have Tehmina Arora. Tehmina is the founding trustee of ADF India and the director of Advocacy for Asia for ADF International. Tehmina also previously served as a senior fellow for South and Southeast Asia Action Team for the Religious Freedom Institute. And she continues to serve on the boards of several charities, including the Religious Liberty Partnership. In 2018, Arora was awarded the Champion of Human Rights Award by the Delhi Minority Commission for her services to the community. And she has her law degree from Delhi University and bachelor's degree in arts from Kamala Nehru College at Delhi University. Our other speaker is Yaqiu Wang, and Yaqiu Wang is a research director for China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan at Freedom House, leading the organization's research on human rights issues with China and the Chinese government's global influence. Prior to joining Freedom House, Wang was a senior China researcher at Human Rights Watch, working on issues including internet censorship, protection of human rights defenders, and women's rights. And then before Human Rights Watch, Wang worked on press freedom issues in China and other Asian countries for the Committee to Protect Journalists. Wang was born and grew up in China and has an MA degree in International Affairs from George Washington University. So let me now turn it over to Tehmina to get us started, and then on to Yaqiu, and then we can have a conversation and questions after that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity, and I congratulate East West Center for this important discussion, and Knox on his book, incredibly important to be able to document, and as he mentioned, and shine a spotlight on some of these issues going on. My comments are on India. I'll try and focus for the first few, maybe I have about 10 minutes, to look at some of the trends that we're seeing here, but then also looking at some of, at least trying to see what's worked, what's not worked, all in 10 minutes. But I just want to start with a very common trend, unfortunately, which has been violence, and Knox referenced this, violence surrounding the cow. There are various communities across India that eat beef, that slaughter buffaloes for meat. And linked to this has been a lot of violence over the years. And just on the 30th of December, most recently in the state of Uttar Pradesh, there was another Muslim man who was lynched to death because of this. What is extremely disturbing in some of these cases is, of course, the violence that's happening against very often Muslim or tribal communities. There have been several instances where Muslims in particular have been targeted. But what is extremely distressful about this also is that the violence is often caught by the mobs that are going around. There are videos available, sadly, on YouTube, where you will see these groups target, chase down trucks, chase down people that they believe are transporting cattle for slaughter, and then attack them. And this is a trend that we've seen in various other instances, but here in particular, where Muslim men are very often Muslim men, in fact, targeted and killed, all available, or the violent attacks all available on YouTube as a way to build up or mobilize others to get involved in this. What is also happening is that this violence, especially cow vigilantism, is being used by these mobs, the leaders of these mobs, to sort of put themselves forward as, the protectors of the community, and also is leading to many of them joining politics itself. Another trend that we've seen is the violence surrounding religious festivals. In India, we celebrate many, many festivals, not so much on religious freedom festivals, but we enjoy our festivals, and many of them overlap. So, and because communities live with such close proximity towards each other, as these groups very often, I would say not necessarily genuine worshippers, but again, mobs of young men taking out processions in largely Muslim-dominated areas, or Muslim procession going through Hindu-dominated area, these getting attacked, violence on both sides, resulting in severe, entire towns getting burnt down, people getting killed. It starts with stone pelting, a lot of sloganeering that happens, but then leading to this violence. And based on all of this is something that the Indian state sadly has weaponized, is the attacks that take place post such events. Now, what is happening is that when there is a little riot or a skirmish that even breaks out, very often, states, especially in Madhya Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh, this has been a particular trend, where the state will then declare that, especially when it comes to the Muslim homes in that area, have been illegally set up, they don't have the requisite permissions, and they will bulldoze those homes. So you've just come out of a riot, your homes, your families have been attacked, and now you are being accused of illegally occupying a particular area or not having the correct permissions for your home, and your home is being bulldozed by the state. And this has happened in several instances across the country. Thankfully, very recently, the Supreme Court put at least some sort of brakes on this and has passed an excellent order creating several guidelines looking at how the state should or should not operate in such areas. Unfortunately, we see that this continues, even often in contempt of court. So that's still going on, but it's good to see the court at least respond to it. So that's on the Muslim side, violence against cow-related incidents, but also then the religious processions. When it comes to Christians, we've seen that the allegations have been primarily on conversion. And in this last year, the United Christian Forum documented over 830 odd attacks where Christians had been targeted, very often in their homes, in their churches. This included even murders. But I do want to point out one particular trend that is going on in the Middle Eastern state of Chhattisgarh, which is a concept of social ostracization. So there'll be one or two Christian families in the village, and they're being told that you cannot remain as a Christian in the village. Everyone else is either tribal communities or worshippers of animism or Hindus, and you are not welcome any longer. They may have lived there for generations, but you cannot live here any longer. You do not have access to the village well. You don't have access to the village resources. Your crops are being burnt. Your family is being attacked. You're basically being told you are person non grata. And this goes to the extent of even people being or families being targeted when there's been a death in the family. So a Christian dies, to give you an example, just in this last 2 weeks, we've had cases like this. A Christian dies in the village. The family wants to proceed to burial spaces, which are common, or even in their own plots on their own land. And they're being told by the village, you cannot bury your dead unless you reconvert to Hinduism. And we've had to go to the High Court to get orders asking for protection for Christians to bury their dead. So you can just understand the kind of hostility, both social, but then also through the state. And this has come in, of course, the allegations of conversion, but this also then comes in, and you would know this in terms of the anti-conversion laws that are now in 11 states, or sorry, actually 12 states in India, where you have laws that regulate or restrict religious conversions. And this is not, these are not ordinary laws in the sense where, okay, you just, even if you have to fill out a form, I think that's terrible. But even as the original laws said in 67, 68, you fill out a form and that's it. Now you have to seek permission from the state. The local authority is to investigate your religious conversion. They have to grant you permission before you can convert, 30, 60 days in advance. You are being penalized. We have several cases that we've been tracking where Christians have been penalized for carrying Bibles. This has been seen as objectionable material. Conversion material, it's called. We've had Christians arrested in the state of Uttar Pradesh for celebrating birthday parties, wedding receptions, because all of this has been seen as a way to induce somebody to the faith. Marriages between Christians or Hindus and Muslims are being seen as attempts to convert them. So all of this under pressure. In Uttar Pradesh now, the law will actually say that if you try and convert somebody by force, fraud, or inducement, you can get the life sentence for something like this. This is insane. Pastors are being arrested under the Gangster Act in Uttar Pradesh because they have shared the gospel with someone. So this is a trend that we're seeing across. Several more instances. I will try and get to perhaps some of the things that we've seen that have worked, which are really legal trainings on the ground and providing legal support. It takes time, it's expensive, it's tedious sometimes, but we're seeing results in the court, even though it takes multiple cases before you can get the relief you need, but we're beginning to see some of that. So I would highly commend that and happy to get back into some of those discussions subsequently. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tehmina. Really appreciate that. Yaqiu, please, your remarks.
Thank you so much for having me. We discussed this very important issue on this day. I'm going to talk about the situation in China. I'm going to divide the persecution into two kind of categories. I'm going to describe the situation there, the trends, the characteristics. Then I'm going to talk about the international society, whether it's the government or the civil society, how they have responded to the persecution in China, and whether they have worked and going forward, what do we need to do? In China, there are two kinds of, I wouldn't say two kinds, but I would separate them to two kinds persecution. One is targeted at groups that are that their religions are tied to their ethnicities. So they have their particular religious practices. They also have their particular culture practice, their own language, and the most two distinct groups are Tibetans and Turkic Muslims, which the Uyghurs are the majority of Turkic Muslims, but there are other groups who are also Turkic Muslims. I think, you probably have all heard on the news, especially regarding the persecution of Uyghurs. It has going on, since started. They all have always been persecuted, but the kind of a crackdown, kind of severity the campaign started in late 2016 and 2017. And it's still going. In 2022, the UN published a report, saying the kind of persecution that is going on in the Xinjiang region among two crimes against humanity, and the US has designated it it's genocide. I worked on this Uyghur issue, the research issues at the Human Rights Watch. So I have spoken to many victims who have left, who were fortunate to fled, or who were so fortunate that they were not in the Xinjiang region when the persecution started. They were luckily enough that they decided to, I'm gonna stay here rather than returning to China. So the situation is horrific. It is ongoing. Given so much coverage, I feel the changes are I would say the overall the government is not responding to the changes. They made some changes. For example, the camps are kind of what do we know from the camps in terms of about 1 million people who are being detained in the camps. They're kind of weighing down the camps. However, they have transferred the people who are detaining those camps to formal prisons. So a lot of people get like formal sentenced, and they are now in the prison. And then there are the people who are being transferred into factories to make them productive workforces. The government is saying, we have done our re-education of them. The re-education, we completed the 5-year re-education. Now we're moving to the next stage. So I feel, from my research, I would say the government had already planned this step of transferring people from the camps to the factories or the prisons. But I do also think the government at least understand the international pressure and hear that. So that's, why they have to come out and defend the camp saying, this is not persecution, people need to be trained so they can be productive workforces. The other group is obviously Tibetans. I would say the biggest issue right now is the residential schools. The government calls them, boarding schools. Some estimates shows that about 3/4 of Tibetan children who are 6 years or older are now in in boarding schools. They are forcibly taken away from their family and put in those schools where they can't go home regularly. They're being taught in Chinese language. The children are punished for speaking Tibetan or practicing the Tibetan culture. I mean, 3/4, that's a lot of people. I mean, there are reports of that children feel depressed and they feel very isolated and all that. And this has, I mean, the coverage of this issue internationally, I would say, begin 2 or 3 years ago. I mean, but I don't think the Chinese government is responding to that kind of coverage, and this issue is still ongoing. Recently, the New York Times has an piece. They got a lot of videos on the Chinese internet. The videos are just, the video is not, people were talking about how they are persecuted or, how they feel frustrated. It's the Chinese government's propaganda saying, Tibet children are learning Chinese, they are having a great time at those schools and all that stuff. But of course, the background is that the children are forced into that situation and they're separated from their family. This is, the situation regarding the religious persecution targeting certain ethnic groups. Then the other persecution targeting the Han Chinese, the ethnic majority. There are people who practice Catholicism, Christianity, and Falun Gong, and they are also, persecuted. It's not necessarily targeted to their culture or practice or their language and all that. It's more targeting that because they don't follow the CCP. They are, they wanted to practice their own religion autonomously. They don't want to, take the orders from the CCP. And overall, I think the kind of a persecution is different, but there's still some kind of, practice, like allowing you to practice on the surface. There are Catholic church you can go to, there are Christian church you can go to. But then, of course, even in a Catholic church, you have to put up slogans of Xi Jinping. This is, you are supposed to follow the CCP first, then you can, abiding to God is secondary to abiding to the rules of the CCP. And Falun Gong, the persecution of Falun Gong is very severe. It's I would say it's more Chinese indigenous religious practice, and it got really big during 20 years ago, and there were a lot of Han Chinese people practicing. When I was a child in China, and I just knew people around me practicing it, and it got so big, and it really got scared of CCP, and the crackdown has been so severe that you can be sentenced to many years in jail. You are get taken to those special, again, re-education classes, and people get tortured in this situation. So as I said, those are necessarily targeting at their cultural practice. It's language practice. It's just they wanted to practice their religion independently. I was hearing Tehmina's talk. She keeps saying the word violence. In India, there are lynches, there are mobs, but in China you don't hear those words. There's no mobs, there's no lynches, and you don't see people get killed. I think I would just, it's not that China, the situation is better. It's just the repression, the persecution is very different. In a way, the Chinese government is very sophisticated to execute religious persecution, that you don't even see the violence anymore. one big thing is the surveillance is so sophisticated. Give a good example is in Xinjiang. It's like they have cameras everywhere. They can identify your faces, and they also use predictive AI. For example, they can track, if you order like weights, we lift the weights, and then you become a suspect. Because why you're ordering weights? Why do you want to exercise more? Is it because that you want to join some violent group? So then they go find you saying, why are you doing this, right? And then also if there are cameras everywhere. Usually, if you go out of your house from the front door, but now you have a habit of going. Leave your house from the back door, and that would alert system saying, why are you leaving your house from the back door? That's like a normal situation. Then they go to your home and ask, what are you doing? So in a way that the technology is so sophisticated, and the repression, the structural repression is so sophisticated that they kill any kind of organized resistance at the very, very bottom level. So if they never arise to any kind of obvious violence. So that speaks to the kind of severity and the kind of sophistication that's I think it's very unique to China. And then another issue I think is quite unique to China is that we hear those persecutions of Uyghurs, Tibetans, Falun Gongs, but we don't see images, right? The image we see about the camps are just, satellite images and some pictures from the propaganda. You just see the kind of the bad, horrifying sufferings of people. It's also because the government is very, very good at controlling the internet, controlling the press. Of course, there's no independent press in China, but for foreign press, they can, if you try to go to Xinjiang to have a look, you get immediately alerted by the police because you enter your ID when you purchase a flight. You have to enter your ID. Then the government gets alerted. They're going to follow you everywhere when you're in Xinjiang. So it makes coverage of very, almost impossible. That's why, what the image we see from the press is mostly satellite images of a school, of a camp. And that really, as a human rights researcher and advocate, that really make our case harder because, the public wants to see images of violence to understand the situation, because those images are very, direct. It's like a direct to evoke emotions. But when you don't have those images, when you just have words, the public's not that tuned into that, violence are everywhere, right? In Gaza, in India, and then, that's really plays into the CCP's advantage in terms of mitigate the international attention on the persecutions in China. Also, it's also very hard for our human rights researchers to research because you can't talk to people within China because the surveillance is so sophisticated. You can't talk to people even when they flee China, after they flee China, because then as long as you have family ties in China, your family gonna, especially in this Xinjiang, your family could totally go to jail. Your entire family can go to jail because of what you say outside of China. So that kind of, that's transnational repression, kind of limit what can be said, what can be done, what can be said, and what can be uncovered with regard to the situation in China. In terms of addressing the issue, I totally agree with what Knox said. The calling out, it's very, very important. Even it's hard to change what's going on in China. The Chinese government does feel the pressure, and even it's hard to get someone to be released. At least the government knows the international attention there. They treat the prisoners better comparing when there's no attention. And that's very, very important. And also a lot of people, they're not expecting to be released just because there's international attention, but they feel, a sense of solidarity, a support when the international attention is there. And to them, it's extremely important. And then, also want to emphasize what Knox said about partnership. China is very, very powerful. It's a near peer competitor. So the US has to work with other governments together to put pressure on China. I think lastly, I also wanted to to echo what Knox says, that, if China is abusive, is powerful, and people know the Chinese government is very abusive. How for the U.S. government to stand out, in contrast to a near peer competitor, is to uphold the values the U.S. has always said it supports. That's how you separate from China. It's not just great power competition. It's about we uphold certain values and you don't. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Yaqiu. Really appreciate it. Now we'll kind of do a little bit of we'll do the Q&A and talk with our panelists about these important issues. So Knox, if I can ask you kind of one of the first questions is, you talked about kind of accountability, and sometimes I think people who are not always doing religious freedom, but they're kind of they know about it, they feel like the State Department Human Rights Report and the Commission on International Religious Freedom, those reports, sometimes I think they think that's accountability on it, versus I think when I was listening to it, I thought, well, maybe those are call outs versus accountability. And then kind of comparing that to sort of the internal accountability within the country that has those religious freedom issues. So can you kind of talk about that dynamic of outside NGOs or other organizations and their reports and their emphasis on these issues versus kind of the internal, and kind of how we think about accountability and call outs?
Yeah, that is a great question. And, I definitely view the reports as more of a call out than accountability, although I will caveat that by saying, for another government to see that their bad deeds are known and have found their way into U.S. report, that's the beginning of accountability. That's an important first step. And, these reports are really a pretty easy first step for the U.S. to start to bring about accountability. Just talk about it. We get these reports from our partners. We then, it is vetted. I was a part of these reports for years. And then by having it underneath the Great Seal of the United States, it elevates the issue and it puts governments on notice. The problem is, and this is something I talk about in the book, is what happens next. And I kind of deal with this tension of, on the one hand, the United States, it does more than any other country in the world to advance religious freedom for other people of other faiths outside of our borders. And I was always proud to be a part of that. I was proud to be representing this fundamental American value, and to see that the U.S. was talking about these issues. But the fact that we're good doesn't mean we're good enough to combat this pandemic of persecution that's sweeping the world. And with these three countries that we're talking about today, China, India, and Myanmar, it's going to take more than just the call outs. Call outs are a good first step. In a country like India, with its more open press environment, these reports can really have outsized influence for what they are at the end of the day. And I think that opens up more possibilities for encouraging India to go back to its roots of secularism and multiculturalism in a way that's not available in China or Myanmar because they're much more closed. But then it's following up with the consequences, and in both looking at China and Myanmar, I talk a lot about in the book about the Magnitsky Act as this new innovation in how the United States can bring about some consequences in a targeted way. We've seen how the nationwide sanctions only hurt the people we're trying to help because the rulers can insulate themselves and find other ways to get what they need to stay in power. But the Magnitsky Act gives us this scalpel to target individuals who are directly involved in persecution, to freeze their bank accounts, to shut off visas to the US. And that's not the ultimate accountability we would hope for, but it's another step towards that. And I've seen Freedom House talk about how there have been officials in Myanmar that have chosen not to do an act of persecution because they've seen the generals, some key generals named to this Magnitsky Act. And, one day they'd love their kids to go to the United States for university or for a job. And so it created that deterrence, which is so important. And so I think the reports are a first step. The information is a first step, and then it's a matter of following through. And that's where I think we need to continue as a country to do better.
Great, thank you for that. So one of the questions we had was asking about, maybe to all three of you, where do you see potential for international cooperation kind of beyond the US's unilateral actions? And are there any particular actors or groups that we see as especially influential in this field that we should also be looking at and looking toward in this effort? Tehmina, do you want to start with that, or anyone else?
Yeah, I was just thinking both in terms of reflections in India, but also thinking about Pakistan, to build on what Knox was saying. I think the European Union has played, I'm just thinking about the recent resolution on Manipur, calling that out, but also then forcing the Indian state to think about its own actions subsequent to that. That was a report by the IRFBA, and I will probably get the acronym incorrect, but Knox can correct me on that. But having these reports highlighting very clearly the responsibility of the state is an incredible first step. Calling it out, but then, like Knox said, the follow-up that happens. But I'm thinking in particular about Pakistan, where this whole issue of forced conversion, of minor girls in particular, has been a huge issue, and the repeated calling out of Pakistan on that, just the fact that they don't have policy, they've not created uniform law, has begun. I do think it's having an impact there. So there are certain states where that the calling out follows the accountability of the state to bring in policy. You may not be able to roll back policy as much because it takes more political will, I think, but to implement, especially on forced marriage and conversion, we've seen that. I do think it's beginning to see some impact in Pakistan in particular. In India, I think we're a little more thick-skinned. We need more calling out, but then supplemented by actions on the ground. So I think the European Union, the IRFBA, all incredibly important instruments or institutions rather, to call out and then hold governments accountable. These are built into our trade policies. We need to be talking more about them. Yeah.
Just build on what Knox said too, in terms of Magnitsky, that's a US law, right? We want other, especially Western governments all across the world, to have the same targeted sanctions against human rights perpetrators in China. Because Knox said if their children want to come to US, then okay, can't come to the US. How about go to London? It's a great city, right? So the attractive countries have to enact the same kind of sanctions. So the government, the Chinese officials feel the pressure. I really literally can have a way out of this situation. I feel that Magnitsky actually is has the most effect in Hong Kong. A good example is the former chief executive of Hong Kong, basically the mayor of Hong Kong, was sanctioned, and of course the bank account was frozen. Then she had to get her salary from the cash, so her salary they have to give the cash to her. It's like a huge embarrassment for like a person like that. Even that news kind of had an effect to the officials in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is an international finance center, right? It's so connected to the world, the rest of the world. So I do think it's useful at least. it's effective for officials in places that are more connected to the international world. And if Western governments do it together, it would be more meaningful. And the other accountability, really, I feel has been hugely powerful, is the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which basically presumes that any kind of products that are made, whether it's in whole or in part in Xinjiang, is made of forced labor, just given the situation is so repressive and people have no autonomy, unless you can prove that, you know, this product is not made of forced labor, which the bar is very high for a company to prove that. And, you know, I think half of the world's cotton, maybe 20% of the world's cotton were made in Xinjiang, and half of the tomatoes come from Xinjiang. If I get the numbers wrong, sorry. A lot of the, you know, some very important products the rest of the world use come from Xinjiang. So, you know, that has a huge effect in terms in how China conducts its export. And we all know, you know, China is not democracy. The CCP's legitimacy rests on its economic performance, and how do you target the economy of China is a very important. The problem with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act is it's I would say, you know, it's enforcement. You know, I live in DC. I go to the suburb of Virginia, and I would see Chinese grocery stores. And I would see like a bag of dates, it says Xinjiang, from Xinjiang. I was like, you know, it's obviously, it says Xinjiang, you don't even need more proof. And it's still getting into the United States. So, you know, one thing that the US government needs to do more is how you need to hire more people. People have the expertise to do the research in terms of busting products that are still come from Xinjiang. They need better, you know, enforcement. So I think the government is realizing that. I mean, you have to, in order to hire more people, you have to go jump through the hoops, and you know, there are political complications regarding that. But that is, I think, it's an obvious direction in terms of you know, enforcing any existing law. Thanks.
And I would just add the IRFBA is the International Religious Freedom or Belief Alliance. It's about 40 countries. It's about 3 or 4 years old. And it's a good news story of, again, countries from different regions of the world, different political backgrounds, religious backgrounds, coming together around this belief that everyone has the right to religious freedom and shouldn't be punished for practicing those beliefs peacefully. In the Asia region, it's mainly, you know, Western Hemisphere and Europe, but Australia, Japan, and South Korea are all participating. So it does span the globe and has an important Asian component to it, which is crucial since so many of these challenges we're talking about are in the Indo-Pacific.
Great, thank you. So another kind of question is picking up on this idea that Tehmina was talking about as the social kind of persecution versus a state level persecution. So how much can we sort of attribute or differentiate between those two when we're looking at countries? And is there a different way we're supposed to be targeting or calling out those differences between those two?
I think in India, one fuels the other. You have mob violence that leads to certain laws getting implemented, certain laws then leading to further mob violence. The anti-conversion law is in particular very good example of this. You will have mobs that will start showing up in a particular state, attacking churches, Christians, Muslims, calling out religious conversions, forcible religious conversions. What that means is not very clearly defined, because force is very broadly defined in the acts which comes in. But then the state comes in with these anti-conversion laws in that particular state, leading to further violence. So now the mobs have a license to go from home to home. In the state of Karnataka, for example, they have actually incentivized it. So if you provide information about what is seen as forcible conversion or conversion by inducement, you will actually get a benefit from the state. So incentivizing these mobs, incentivizing cow vigilantism, because they sort of one fuels the other. But I think for me, the bigger concern is the social violence, because it is, I'll give you a very personal example from something that happened with a friend of mine in Delhi, where they were meeting during this Christmas season. They were having some time, and they called for food delivery. And the person comes over, they deliver the food. While they're doing that, they hear Christian music, songs. And because there are 5 people sitting in the house, this delivery man reports this to the police in Delhi. And you're thinking, what has happened? Delhi doesn't have an anti-conversion law. He says this is, conversion activity going on. Police shows up. Thankfully, because there's no law and they're only just friends sitting together, nobody gets arrested. But in other states, that's exactly this sort of behavior that's leading to people getting arrested at birthday parties, at wedding receptions. So the social common sense that there is this illegal activity that you have to look out for, you have to watch, you have to watch these groups. That, I think, is hitting at the core of what it meant to be Indian. Growing up, I never felt, I mean, I would perhaps say my church friends would tell me I should have felt like a Christian, but you didn't have that idea. That was not the identity that came out foremost. But unfortunately now, that is the only identity that people see me with. They don't see me as, a dog lover, a gardener, whatever, a lawyer. No, those are not my identities. I'm only seen as a Christian, and it doesn't really matter whether you're a practicing Christian or not, or a practicing Muslim or not, you can still get targeted. You are Christian enough, Muslim enough to be targeted by your name. So yeah, it's just problematic, I think. The law can't solve that problem.
I think the situation in China is quite different. First, I just want to say the societal prejudice against Tibetans and Uyghurs are very severe. The stereotypes that they don't work hard, they're comparing with the Chinese, they're lazy, they don't go to school, they don't strive to be better, that kind of thing. Especially regarding Uyghurs, there's another issue, they are violent people. However, because the CCP is also very afraid of the Chinese people's organizing themselves, so even the people have prejudice, societal prejudice against the minority groups, the CCP wouldn't allow them to express that kind of discrimination, prejudice. So there's no mobs against the Uyghurs or Tibetans, because the Han Chinese people are also very repressed. So I think in China, the bigger problem is absolutely the state persecution of a religious group comparing with the people.
And I think, both of these present 2 distinct challenges for the incoming Trump administration. If they're going to, in the first Trump administration, I served in a special envoy role on these issues, and they did a lot to promote religious freedom for everybody. And assuming they pick up where they left off, the challenges that both these colleagues enunciated need different solutions. So I remember when I was at the State Department, you go from meeting to meeting to meeting, and I'd be dealing with like some former Soviet dictatorship, and then go to deal with a democracy that was having instances of persecution. And you'd think that would be the easier country to deal with, but I actually found the dictatorship easier to deal with because there was just one person to convince. I could convince the guy at the top, and it was almost always a guy, to change their ways through, encouragement, coercion, cajoling. We could see some progress made. And I talk about in the book progress we saw in Uzbekistan and Central Asia. But then you look at a country like India, Nepal, Pakistan, that are democracies, that people can vote, and the leaders have actually run on a platform of divisiveness. And so when they get into power and U.S. diplomats would raise concerns, their answer is, I'm delivering on the promises I made when I was campaigning. And so how do we as the United States, how do we as a community of values across the world communicate to sort of at the grassroots level the importance of individual rights, equal citizenship, freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or belief, that diversity is a good thing, and how to live together peacefully in this diversity. Because if we keep going at having to insist that our way is the only way, and this is, I think, a challenge everywhere these days, it's just going to lead to greater fracturing and ultimately human rights violations. So how are policymakers thinking about these two challenges is going to take different tools to meet these challenges.
Yeah, one of the things you're talking about with the fracturing, I think sometimes countries feel that the call out and the emphasis on religious freedom is only kind of when our relations are bad, and that we're just trying to punish them on religious freedom because we can't punish them on other things that we're upset about. And so how does that sort of dynamic come across in policymaking when you're trying to say, well, we've been talking about this for a long time. It's not just now that when we have difficulty in our trade relationship or our military relationship and security relationship, and you see this report or you see our call out on this, and you think that's part of this other effort.
Well, I mean, it's this idea of consistency that if we really believe this is an important human right, that it's a foundational value of our country, and we want to carry this forward in our diplomacy, then we just talk about it with friend and foe. Now, how that plays out will be different. China, the way the relationship is going to be a more aggressive approach. India, we are democracies. We have lots of communal ties between our countries. So we're going to talk to them differently. But, you know, there's a saying here, friends don't let friends drink and drive. Well, friends don't let friends commit human rights abuses. And so we know from our own painful experience with civil rights abuses, often based on race, increasingly along religious lines, that if we allow those to fester, bad things happen that hurt our ability as a country to function as effectively and as successfully as we can. And we want our friends to learn. They should learn from our painful lessons. Don't, you know, we can give you a big shortcut around some painful lessons if you can listen and learn from what the mistakes we've made. But I think too often policymakers have these short-term goals, and they're willing to kind of give up the long-term concern for the win now. And governments are smart. They know our election cycles. They know that Mr. Trump's only going to have 4 more years. And so how can they maximize the benefits to their agenda while providing the minimum response is always a game that's played. And I think we've played it very poorly. And time and time again, I think we've been outmaneuvered, and we just need to be, if we're consistent, if we really make this the North Star to our diplomacy, values and interests tied together, we can see changes made that are in our long-term security interests and a reflection of our values. But it starts with being consistent, and it's really hard. I mean, foreign policy is often about hypocrisy for all countries, but how do we lessen that so that we're true to these values?
To build on that, absolutely consistency. The other is, you know, as Knox said earlier, partnership. Because I get that pushback all the time. Oh, the US doesn't really care about China's human rights issues. It's just because it's a, you know, competitive. It's all about great power competition. They're just using human rights as a tool. And then my pushback would be, you know, it's not just the US government is criticizing China, but ABC, XYZ governments are doing the same. Even some, you know, countries that are more friendly with China are criticizing the Uyghur issue because they are Muslim countries. So, you know, we needed the US. One message to the US is that you really need to work with partners, so to make your China criticism more credible.
Do any of the panelists see, I'm thinking of countries now sort of targeting people overseas that are criticizing kind of the government back home. Do any of the panelists see this happening on religious grounds as well?
I can say definitely we've had instances where people, either people in the Indian diaspora or I don't know, in Knox, I think in your book you mentioned about visa restrictions on you, where you're trying to move. So those are some pushbacks that you get from governments. The Indian government has particularly been hard on groups wanting to come into the country. So you not necessarily taking action against them by filing complaints. So there have been attempts like that also, but just not allowing people into the country and forcing them. So especially if you're OCI card holders, which is overseas citizens of India, your card getting cancelled, not being able to come back and meet family and friends. And of course, as was mentioned also, the concern you have for your family back home, that is a genuine concern. There has been targeting like that, yeah.
In China, definitely. I mean, the Chinese government target its critics outside of China, or using their Chinese relatives and family as hostages to silence the critics outside China. That's, I mean, at Freedom House we say that's transnational repression. China is the biggest the Chinese government is the biggest perpetrator of transnational repression. But I wanted to say something about how we address this issue, because if people live in the U.S., they have the right to exercise their freedom of speech. If a person is targeted in the U.S., for example, harassment by some people you don't know, send you messages saying if you still criticize Beijing, this is gonna happen to you. Or you go to an event, you see, people taking pictures, suspicious pictures of you, video of you. So for anything that happened in the United States, the U.S. government can address that. I feel this issue, the awareness of this transnational repression issue in the U.S. has gone, up and up. And I do think the U.S. government, whether it's DOJ or it's FBI or even, local police force, are getting a better hold of this issue. They can address if the things is happening in the U.S.
I think this is where we need to think about if there are foreign actors operating on our soil, attacking Americans for their exercising their civil rights here, that should be a really big problem. And I don't think it gets the attention it deserves bilaterally. And even on issues as simple as a visa, Tehmina mentions the difficulty of Americans like myself or others to go into India. There's no reciprocity on our visa policies here. There's Indians can come in very easily on religious workers, not sure where the Trump administration is going to go on this, but the Project 2025 paper focused on the State Department talks about visa reciprocity. If you don't give us visas, then we don't give you visas. And I think that's just fair. And so if India is going to cause problems for Americans who want to go meet with other faith communities that are shared, are denied because they're Christian or Muslim, then there should be, at least as a foundational point, reciprocity. And we not give benefits to foreign nationals that they don't give to our own citizens.
Knox, you mentioned that there were some positive trends or some countries that have done some positive things. Can you talk a little bit more about those and how we might be able to apply them to some other countries in Asia?
Yeah, I have a long discussion about work we did on Uzbekistan in Central Asia, where we were able to bring both sort of carrots, encouraging at the time the new president who wanted to pivot away from Russia towards the United States, with a legitimate threat of consequences should they continue to propagate the previous president's religious freedom policies that were incredibly negative. And it was that combination of extending a hand. We want to partner with countries that share our values. But if you continue to lock up thousands of Muslim men because they have a beard or pray 5 times a day, or if you continue to refuse to register churches and other non-Muslim communities because they're churches and non-Muslim communities, we had them designated as a country of particular concern, and we made it clear that they had a choice. They could walk towards us, reform these laws, let people out of jail, or they could continue on the old policies, and that would lead to the lifting of the waiver of sanctions, and we would get serious about exacting a consequence. And so it was that combination, I think, that really worked well, and President Mirziyoyev started to walk towards us and our policies, and we saw the beginning of change. Now, Uzbekistan is not perfect. With the fall of the Republic of Afghanistan and the return of the Taliban, the neighborhood got a lot tougher since they made reforms, but they're in a better place than they were because we were able to smartly leverage our influence with credible threats of consequences with an invitation to a positive engagement. And once they made those changes, we took them off this CPC list. And I had then diplomats from other CPC countries, Tajikistan and Saudi Arabia, both approached me saying, how do we get off this list? Like, what can we do? So, again, sticking with our values, led other countries to start to reconsider their abusive policies. So it can be done. China and India are two of the most difficult. China, the most difficult, because it has so many resources now. But it's not impossible. Really hard is not impossible. And even if we're just talking about individual prisoners and we see people let out of jail, that's a win. That saves a life, that saves a family, it saves a future. And we take the wins where we can get them while working for the long-term systematic change.
Yaqiu, with your previous work on for protection of journalists, can you talk a little bit about kind of the connection between press freedom and religious freedom? You talked about the need for us to be able to get reports, get accurate reporting on what's going on. Can you talk a little bit about that, and any other panelists that wants to join in and talk about that issue as well?
It's so important. I mean, I've been working on this issue over a decade, and especially, just the time I spend trying to vetting, the accounts. Now I'm just venting the frustration over the years. It's so difficult. The government doesn't release any information, like on any kind of sentencing, right? Sometimes I would get a leak. Someone took a picture of the verdict, and that it was like so precious. Oh my God, I got this real evidence, right? And for them to leaking to me, it's so dangerous. Like all this mental energy goes into trying to verify certain accounts, try to protect the people who gave me the information. It just becomes so hard, and that has so much to do with the government is very good at controlling the internet, surveilling people, any kind of international messaging apps, WhatsApp or Signal, whatever, are all banned in China, and you have to use the Chinese apps, and then of course those apps are surveyed. So I mean, it's really, really difficult. I feel like whether it's Tibetans or Uyghurs or Falun Gongs, so many terrible things, so many terrible long sentences, and even deaths in prisons that we have no idea of because of there's no press coverage, not by the domestic press, not by the foreign press. So I always just tell people, okay, we need to wait for the day when the archives are all opened, and then we can go dig what actually happened. It's just such an unfortunate reality. But I always encourage people to be more innovative. To look for evidence through other avenues, satellite images, do some sleuths on the internet, try to find the information, and build good connections with the diaspora communities of Uyghurs, Tibetans, because they have certain connections. So try to stay positive and be innovative.
Great. So I wanted to give us some time here to give any final thoughts and final words on this topic. So with our last 10 minutes here. So Tehmina, I don't know if you want to start with any final thoughts or things we should be thinking about as we go forward.
Yeah, I think just in terms of, I mean, what has been shared, but religious freedom and human rights is so incredibly important. And these are, as Knox said, it's the long game. You have to play the long game. We can't think of short-term wins, though they're great. We must try and look for what we can, but also remember that we fight not only for ourselves, we fight for our children's children. So, we must engage with consistency. I think that's incredibly important. But balancing both the social and the legal together, for me, that's been incredibly important. That even as we fight the legal fights, we have to take time to work with communities. You have to try and find those co-belligerents or co-sufferers, whatever they may be, work together to building that solidarity. But sadly, that's not going to be enough. So making sure you're doing the hard work of the documentation, you're doing the hard work of filing these cases, spending time, building up the structures, because these structures, I mean, they take time, but they will last, they will outlive us. So we must work towards that. And we talk about, identifying an institution that you want to protect and start working towards building that up. Take the time to invest in it, because the institution needs to protect you subsequently. So, if the judiciary and the legal system for me, and spending time making sure we are getting the right people in terms of building up the lawyers on the ground to litigate these cases. So play the long game. This is not a battle for tomorrow only. Yeah, for many tomorrows. That's all. Yeah.
Same, play the wrong game. And I really want to say, I appreciate that we host this event to talk about religious freedom in not America. Because, I feel so much attention has been around the world. Everybody's focused on the problems in America, right? TikTok could be banned in the US, and a lot of American users are fleeing to another Chinese social media platform called Red Note. I was like, it speaks to part of the failure of the human rights community. Like, how do people think, the other platform can offer the same freedom? Like, I understand that you're frustrated with TikTok being possibly banned, but then you're going to use a very, very censored Chinese app. Like, do you know how bad is censorship in China? I think it's because people oftentimes don't realize how bad the situation of a lot of things in the rest of the world. So we need to keep, the attention. The world is not just about America. It's a terrible deteriorating situation in India, in Burma, in China. And so just want to say, I appreciate this conversation, and I want this kind of, attention, that kind of discussion continue to, to a billion, more than a billion Indian, more than a billion Chinese. Especially in China, like there's no press freedom in China, there's no internet freedom. The international attention is very, very important. Thank you.
Yeah, again, thanks to the East-West Center for hosting this, and thanks for these colleagues for your work to advocate for human rights and religious freedom. It's people like you who are either in your home country or still working on your country of origin. I think is just inspiring and important. And these challenges are timeless. This is not the first time in human history we're dealing with these things. I was just looking at, since this is Religious Freedom Day here in the US, it's linked to the passing here in the state of Virginia, where I live, just outside of Washington, D.C., the Statute for Religious Freedom, which Thomas Jefferson wrote in 1786. And it starts with this powerful idea. It says, whereas Almighty God hath created the mind free, that all attempts to influence it by temporal punishment or burdens or by civil incapacitations is tyranny. And later he says that our civil rights should have no dependence on religious opinions any more than our opinions in physics or geometry. And I found that phrase just so, it sounds 21st century, even though it was written in the 1700s, that how we address these issues of religious freedom is going to be the work of a generation. We started that project here at our foundation. We're continuing to perfect our union and make sure that all Americans can enjoy equal citizenship regardless of faith or ethnicity. And we've made that part of our foreign policy. And it's crucial that the U.S. And the incoming administration bring our values into these great power conversations, that to do so without our values is to make us no different than the Chinese or the Russians. It's the fact that we care about human rights, that we care about religious freedom in these other countries distinguishes us, and I think makes us ultimately more attractive as partners to the billions of people in the Indo-Pacific region. So I appreciate East West Center providing this platform for us to talk about these issues, and I look forward to continuing to partner with the center.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate Knox Thames, Tehmina Arora, and Yaqiu Wang for this conversation. I mean, like I said, this is a great time to refocus on these issues and to really prepare for this year, and to make sure that we are highlighting and supporting all that we can do on these issues, especially in this important region of the Indo-Pacific, where we have so much going on this year, and there'll be so much to work on. So thank you all for joining us, and we really appreciate it. And please continue to do all the great work that everyone is doing. So have a great day. Happy New Year to everybody. And thanks again.
Thank
you so
you.
much.
Thank you.